Episode 5, The Artist and His Mother, 50 to 59 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Before we get started, I wanted to say thanks for being patient waiting for this episode. As an apology, at the end of this episode, I'll fill you in on a little 202 Decades bonus content coming soon. Last time, we saw Caligula pay the ultimate price for his cruelty. In his place, his uncle Claudius was hailed as princeps by the Praetorians and forced upon the Senate. His forceful entry to the highest level of power earned him many enemies. To the surprise of most, Claudius proved to be a competent and ambitious ruler. He dismantled the systems of taxation, cruelty, depravity, and humiliation that Caligula had built and set about setting right the administration. He improved the city of Rome with massive public works, ruled fairly, and even expanded the empire beyond the bounds where Augustus had left it. His most famous expansion was, of course, the conquest of Britain. While Claudius had very little to do with the campaign on the ground, only being present on the island for 16 days, his will and his planning allowed the invasion to succeed. That's where we left things last time. This decade, we will get to see more of Claudius' personal life and the political affairs that surrounded his regime. Where we pick up in 50 AD, Claudius was married to a woman named Agrippina, designated as the Younger by historians to distinguish her from the other Agrippina, her mother. Although Claudius reportedly had his share of mistresses, that didn't mean he was especially successful with women. Agrippina the Younger was Claudius's fourth wife. Let's look at who each of these women were, as it gives us some insight into Claudius and the political situation of his reign. Plaudia Urgulanilla was Claudius's first wife. They married in 9 AD when he was only 18, and they made it until 24 AD, when he divorced her for her reputation for scandalous affairs, a trend we will see, and alleged involvement in a murder. Next, Claudius married Aelia Paetina in 28. This was a useful marriage for Claudius, as it kept him safe from the purges of the 20s. Aelia's biological father died when she was young, and she was instead adopted and raised by a relative named Lucius Seius Strabo. You get bonus points if you remember who this is. This Strabo was the father of Sejanus, making Aelia his adopted sister. Together, she and Claudius had one daughter, Claudia Antonia. This marriage kept Claudius out of trouble while Sejanus was in favor, but it quickly became a problem for him when Sejanus fell. So Claudius divorced her over some supposed minor squabbles, but the real reason was to keep his head above water of the counter-purges going around. After spending 7 years a bachelor, Claudius remarried in 38 AD to Valeria Messalina. She was a second cousin of Caligula and descended from Mark Antony, Octavia, the sister of Augustus, and the influential Ahenobarbus family. Perhaps the third time would be the charm for Claudius and this distinguished woman. Claudius was older now, 47, but Messalina was no older than 21. Together they had 2 children, a daughter named Claudia Octavia, and a son originally called Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, who later took the name Britannicus after his father's conquests. Despite her pedigree, her reputation was far from noble. While the ancient historians claim many of the upper-class women slept around, noteworthy was Julia, the daughter of Augustus, the claims about Messalina stand out. She supposedly had a competition with a leading prostitute to see who could get around more. Messalina won? Now, you don't have to believe Tacitus on this, but what happened next must have been true. She had been carrying on an affair with an ambitious senator named Gaius Silius for a while now, but in 48, a number of factors led them both to take dramatic action. The two seem to have come up with a poorly designed plan to oust Claudius from the throne. Why? Well, 3 things had come to a head. The first reason was easy. Messalina was young, energetic, and attractive, while she was stuck, at least legally, with the old and boring Claudius. Second, Messalina didn't just have a reputation for sleeping around. Whispers were spreading that the sudden deaths of Marcus Vincius, the husband of Tiberius's granddaughter, and Polybius, one of Claudius's freedmen secretaries, were due to her poison. The death of the latter, Polybius, turned the other freedmen against Messalina. It seems in 48, when she began her plot to unseat Claudius, her nefarious activity was beginning to catch up to her. And third, public favors seemed to be shifting from her to a potential rival, Agrippina the Younger, and her charming young son. This shift in favor is demonstrated by the crowds at the games cheering much more at Agrippina's appearance than Messalina's. It's hard to know how literally to take this demonstration of public approval, but demonstrations like this show up several times in the sources and must have mattered to the powerful in their calculations. With this show of shifting favor toward the popular Agrippina and her son, Messalina worried that she and her son might soon fall out of their position of influence. So she and Silius must have worked in secret to subtly undermine Claudius, right? Well, no, don't be silly. Instead, the two threw a very lavish and very public wedding while Claudius was visiting the port of Ostia. Everyone in Rome knew what was going on, but Claudius was still in the dark to her betrayal. Finally, Narcissus, the freedman advisor to Claudius, decided enough was enough, and he came to Claudius with the news of what was afoot. As Claudius and his entourage cut short the trip to Ostia, Messalina rushed to meet Claudius before he returned to Rome. But Narcissus stopped Messalina from approaching and speaking to him. She was sent away unsure of her fate. Her poorly planned plan had panned out poorly. Claudius and his freedmen advisors met to discuss what the response would be. Openly marrying another man while married to the emperor was treasonous. Narcissus led the call for her execution. Claudius hesitated. He wasn't sure about signing the order of execution of his children's mother. But behind Claudius's back, Narcissus acted. Perhaps he feared what her response would be if she survived this, remembering his poisoned colleague Polybius. Without Claudius's approval, he signed her death warrant. Soldiers were sent to her door, and she was given the chance to take her own life. She couldn't do it, and she was slain by the soldier. Claudius reportedly showed no emotion when he received the news. That was in 48 AD. Yes, last decade, I know, but I think it helps make sense of where things stand in the 50s with Claudius's fourth wife. Upon Messalina's death, many candidates were put forward to marry Claudius. Each of the freedmen backed a different woman, hoping that their support for each would help them gain favor with whoever was chosen. Narcissus recommended remarrying his second wife, Aelia Paetina. The black cloud around her, due to her relation to Sejanus, had faded enough by now, and they did have a child together. Pallas, head of the treasury, recommended Agrippina. This Agrippina was born in 15 AD to Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. Caligula was her brother. At the young age of 13, her marriage was arranged to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, who himself was a grandson of Augustus's sister, Octavia. Together they had a son in 37 named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. 2 years later, she was implicated in a plot to kill Caligula and was exiled to an island off the coast of Italy. She would remain there, separated from her son, for 2 years. When Caligula was finally offed and Claudius became princeps, he brought her back from exile. Her husband had died shortly before her return. Back in Rome now, she courted a married man named Galba, who we'll meet next decade. He rejected her, though. Instead, she married a man named Gaius Crispus Passienus. but he died after only a year of marriage. This left her single, but as I mentioned earlier, throughout the 40s, she increasingly grew in popularity. For the people, she represented the more popular Julian side of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She was, after all, the daughter of the legendary Germanicus. She and her son had become so popular that Messalina, the wife of Claudius, considered them a threat to her and her own son, enough of a threat to take drastic, if poorly planned, action. When Claudius was presented with the prospect of who to marry, Agrippina made a lot of sense. Their marriage would unite the two branches of the Julio-Claudian dynasty instead of holding them in conflict as they had been for decades. Their marriage would bring her and her son into the administration. The issue was there was a bit of an ethical problem with their union. If you've been doing the genealogical calculations in the background, you have by now figured out that Agrippina, Germanicus' daughter, was the niece of Claudius, Germanicus' brother. Even in the Roman world, where cousins could marry without too much concern, the marriage of a niece to uncle was considered obscene. Still, when Claudius weighed the pros and cons of Agrippina versus other candidates, he chose to marry her. The Senate put up some tacit resistance, but was soon convinced of the merits of ending the feud of the Julians and Claudians, and they gave their approval. The two married on New Year's Day of 49. Agrippina and her son quickly adapted to life on top of the Roman social ladder. Many would be content to sit back and enjoy the unparalleled luxuries that being the empress could bring. Not Agrippina. She had a ruthless ambition to bend the Roman world to her will. To achieve this, she would need to remove anyone standing in her way and ensure her long-term position by getting her son to be Claudius's heir. Alright, that was a lot of backstory. Much of it occurred in the 40s, but I didn't want to interrupt the story too much in that decade, and the story of Agrippina flows well into the events of the 50s. The early 50s were marked by a slowdown in the pace at which Claudius enacted new policies and expanded the empire. The conquest of Britain was continuing throughout these early years, mostly successfully. Claudius was now more secure in the throne after proving himself competent for nearly a decade. Throughout these years, Claudius continued the process of centralization of the powers of the princeps. To clarify, princeps is still the term Claudius and his predecessors would have been referred to as. Since Augustus, I've increasingly called the princeps emperor. In Latin, that would be imperator, but at this time the term was used differently than we use the term emperor today. An imperator was a conqueror, someone who had achieved military glory. The term was applied to Caesar and Augustus because of their military success. But increasingly, over the next century, it became more and more associated with the top man in Rome, with or without that military glory. The term princeps, or first citizen, was applied to Augustus and his successors, and since this term reflected the somewhat imagined, somewhat real power sharing between the princeps and the Senate, the term the Principate is sometimes used for the form of government in Rome from Augustus until the crisis of the 3rd century. That may be a long way away, but the process of centralizing power in the princeps rather than in the Senate was already well underway, even if lip service was paid to the Senate often. It had taken Augustus years to negotiate and acquire his powers from the Senate. Tiberius as well had worked carefully not to appear to step on the Senate's toes, even when they preferred he run things. But after 40 years of becoming accustomed to the role of Augustus or Tiberius, Cassius Dio says of Caligula, "Upon his ascension, the Senate voted in a single day all the prerogatives which Augustus over so long a span of time had been voted gradually and piecemeal." Two things can be taken from this. The Senate was more than willing to continue the power of the princeps, but also the Senate still voted on the powers of the princeps, and those powers were seen as emanating from them, from the Senate, rather than originating in the princeps himself. So we see a complicated picture where the princeps was consolidating power over the course of several rulers, but not holding that power completely independently. Claudius, intent on ruling well and making his administration successful and efficient, further centralized the power of his position. A couple of his actions in centralization we saw last decade. He delegated governing and administering the state less to senatorial appointments and more to his freedmen advisors. These freedmen were personally loyal to Claudius, not the Senate or the state as a whole, in their control over justice, the treasury, and even overseeing projects like preparation for the invasion of Britain, effectively granted Claudius expanded powers compared to his predecessors. The other power Claudius had taken back up, which I talked about at the end of the last episode, was the office of censor. With the princeps as censor, even if power emanated from the Senate, the princeps controlled the makeup of the Senate. He could tailor the body to be cooperative and subordinate. During the 50s, Claudius also secured from the Senate the right for financial cases to be decided by procurators. Procurators were imperial appointed officials stationed in each province. With this move, the Senate handed over even its mostly symbolic power to control the finances of the senatorial provinces. The procurators looked to the princeps for their legitimacy and their loyalty. While giving the procurators more power, he attempted to rein in the abuses of the governors. He prosecuted gross corruption by the governors and made sure they had a gap between appointments during which they could be held accountable. Many governors had used their provinces as cash machines, but these reforms helped restrain the abuse and improve the stability of the provinces. We'll talk more about the provinces, the areas outside of Italy that our story has neglected or glossed over, soon. During the early 50s, Claudius continued his work improving the infrastructure of the empire. We saw last decade the new harbor he ordered built to improve grain shipments, and the canal he built to prevent flooding of the Tiber. We'll see the water theme continue here. A city as immense as Rome was difficult to sustain in the classical world and needed great works of infrastructure to support it. The harbor ensured food could arrive, but the city needed water too. Claudius oversaw the completion of 2 new aqueducts to increase the water supply of Rome, the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Anio Nova. I almost included a lengthy tangent on Rome's aqueducts based on the writings of Frontinus, a Roman engineer who wrote about Rome's water system later on during the 1st century, but I eventually decided against it. I know you listen to this show for its thorough hydrological analysis though, so I will plan on including more information on the aqueducts during our end of the century episode, in which we will look more at daily life for the average Roman. So we've got a taste of Claudius's public works, and we've met ambitious Agrippina. These 2 threads come together with the debacle of the Fucine Lake. When I last mentioned Agrippina, I said she was intent to let nothing stand in the way of her keeping and exercising her influence as empress. Well, she would use this debacle to try to shore up her position and attempt to drive a wedge between Claudius and his trusted Narcissus. To put it briefly, the Fucine Lake was a body of water about 55 miles or 88 kilometers east of Rome. The lake was large, once the 3rd largest lake in Italy. It didn't have any natural drainage outlets though, so it was prone to flooding the surrounding communities. Because of its unmoving, stagnant waters, it was also notorious for harboring malaria. Claudius, as part of his public works program, decided the lake should be drained. Like many of these projects, Claudius ordered it and Narcissus planned it. The project had taken 11 years, 30,000 workers, and a huge chunk of money. Finally, in 52 AD, word came that the project was finished. To celebrate, Claudius, Agrippina, and Nero came to the lakeshore, and a huge naval combat battle was held on the lake. Visitors came from all over Italy to see the spectacle. When it came time to open the 3.5-mile, 6-kilometer drainage channel, something went wrong. Upon investigation, part of the tunnel had become blocked or collapsed. The problem would be fixed within a few months, and the lake would shrink by about a third, but the initial failure was an embarrassment. Agrippina took the opportunity to accuse Narcissus of corruption. There must have been some truth to the accusation because Cassius Dio, who was no fan of Agrippina, said, "When the Fucine Lake caved in, Narcissus was severely blamed for it, for he had been in charge of the undertaking, and it was thought that after spending a good deal less than he had received, he had then purposely contrived the collapse, in order that his wrongdoing might not be detected." Her feud with Narcissus went back a few years. When Claudius had been vetting candidates to be his next wife, each of the freedmen had backed a different woman. As I mentioned earlier, Narcissus had backed remarrying Claudius' second wife. Paulus, the freedman in charge of the treasury, had advocated for Agrippina. So, when Agrippina became empress, she held a grudge against Narcissus and favored Pallas, with whom she was having an extended affair. Out of Agrippina's favor, Narcissus still held on hope that her influence at court would be limited. The question of who would be the heir to Claudius was not yet settled between Claudius's natural son, Britannicus, and Agrippina's older son. Narcissus hoped that his influence would ensure Britannicus would be the heir. Agrippina, of course, needed her own son to be next in line. Agrippina's influence at court was felt early after her marriage to Claudius. Within the year, she had convinced Claudius to adopt her son. The young man retired his given name, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and changed it to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Quite the name. I wonder if the average Roman felt such a name was a bit ridiculous with its many callbacks. Nero was still young, only 12, but still older than Britannicus, who was only 8 when Nero was adopted. Here we have another one of those cases where an adopted older son and a younger natural son were placed in competition to be the heir. Previously, we've seen Germanicus versus Drusus, the son of Tiberius, then Caligula versus Gemellus, Tiberius' grandson, and now Nero versus Britannicus. In the prior two instances, the adopted son had won more favor. I think you can guess how this third competition will play out. Agrippina was granted the title of Augusta and was given the right to a special seat at gladiatorial games. She became bold in her role, and according to Cassius Dio, as soon as Agrippina had come to live in the palace, she gained complete control over Claudius. For a while, Claudius seems to have either been ignorant of her machinations or been okay with them. But around 54 AD, he began to have misgivings to the power she wielded. He openly spoke of his poor choice of wives. Looking to limit her power, or out of genuine affection, he began floating the idea of his own son Britannicus becoming his sole heir. He couldn't do that, though, until Britannicus turned 14 and took on the toga virilis, which marked him as entering manhood. Agrippina picked up that her grip on power was slipping and knew her time was short. She had to find a way to ensure her son would become heir before Britannicus came of age. Perhaps with the help of Pallas, she began to plan for Claudius's premature death. First, the pesky Narcissus would have to be taken out of the picture. In an act of what he must have thought was kindness, Agrippina sent Narcissus out of Rome to a hot springs retreat where he could soak his painful, gout-ridden limbs. With her path clear, Agrippina obtained a poison mushroom and slipped it into Claudius's food. He apparently was a heavy drinker of wine, and for the evening it was thought he had just drank too much. He was carried to his room, and over the course of the night, the poison took its effect, and Claudius died. We've encountered several stories of poison in the course of the decades already, but this one seems to be among the best attested. Agrippina almost certainly poisoned her husband to ensure her son's accession. It was the 13th of October, and Claudius had lived 63 years, 2 months, and 13 days, having been emperor 13 years, 8 months, and 20 days. He had been a good emperor, second best only to Augustus so far, although being better than Tiberius or Caligula is a fairly low bar to clear. He had taken a keen interest in bettering the empire and expanding it, rather than moping around in a state as Tiberius had done or living for debaucherous parties as Caligula had done. With Claudius dead, Nero became emperor in 54 AD at the young age of 16. This marks the beginning of a new era in Rome, as Nero was the first emperor who did not know or live during the reign of Augustus. Agrippina had been involved in much of the administration in the last years of Claudius's reign, but with her own young son now in charge, she hoped her role would only grow. To help her guide her son, she relied on 2 tutors. They were Seneca the Younger, a scholar, philosopher, and playwright from the south of what is now Spain, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, who Agrippina had handpicked to support her son. Free from Claudius, Agrippina at first enjoyed more power. She eliminated several people she perceived as opponents, notably Narcissus. For a time, she was even granted the privilege of attending Senate meetings, though behind a curtain. She held court beside her son and even appeared on the other side of coins from Nero. As a rule, though, teenagers are not fond of being constantly instructed or scolded by their parents. Divisions arose between Nero and his mother. First, Nero loved nothing more than music and theater, and he poured his energy and attention into these pursuits rather than governing. Second, young Nero developed a teenager's love for a former slave named Claudia Acte. Highly scandalous for the emperor to be seen with a freedwoman. Agrippina naturally tried to redirect her son to more noble activities, but Nero wouldn't have it. He increasingly favored Seneca and Burrus, who were more tolerant of his extracurricular pursuits. He began to spurn his mother, blocking her out of power. One of the first clear signs of this was when, in 55, he dismissed the freedman Pallas, with whom his mother had been having that long-term affair. Agrippina must have been furious and in distress. She had killed her husband and her uncle, same person, to get her son into power, and now he was shutting her out. Trying to shut her out. But like I said, Agrippina would not let anyone stand in the way of her ambition. With the path to power through her own son closing, she went the opposite direction and began to support Britannicus. Nero and his advisors immediately put a stop to her plotting, though. At a banquet, Britannicus was poisoned. He died only 13 years old, after a youth of playing a pawn in the chess games of others. Agrippina's next angle was through Nero's wife, Claudia Octavia. Although he had no care for his wife, he was tired of his mother's meddling. When word reached him of his mother's most recent scheming, she was kicked out of the imperial residence. Gradually, her titles and honors were stripped from her, and even her bodyguards were removed. This all sounds pretty bad for Agrippina, but it seems she did still exercise some influence over her son. Things came to a head, though, in 59 AD, when Agrippina discovered her son's affair with Poppaea Sabina, a noblewoman 7 years older than Nero. He had grown bored of his childhood crush, Acte, and now the beautiful and cultured Poppaea received his full attention. Apparently, Poppaea resented whatever residual influence Agrippina had over Nero, and she teased him for being a mommy's boy, and convinced him that a real emperor wouldn't put up with such scheming from anyone. Agrippina opposed Poppaea. This snake of a woman was trying to drive a wedge between Nero and his young, chaste, and faithful wife, Octavia. Poppaea's charms won over Agrippina's scolds. Poppaea convinced Nero to finally be rid of his mother. The accounts of what happened next differ slightly between Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. They all tell of various strategies to make Agrippina's death look like an accident, though. Poison, intentionally shipwrecking her, and even rigging ceiling tiles above her bed to fall on her. None of them worked. Nero had to resort to matricide by knife. An assassin was sent to her and killed her. Nero delivered a speech to the Senate, written begrudgingly by Seneca, claiming she had planned to kill him, and when her plot was discovered, she had killed herself. The Senate cheered and expressed their relief that Nero was not harmed. Poppaea, though, was already a married woman. Her husband was a friend of Nero named Otho. Nero and Otho initially got along well, sharing a love of luxury. He was famous for his vainness and attention to his own appearance. While the two were friends, Nero wanted Poppaea to himself. Mercifully, he didn't have Otho killed, instead sending him to the edge of the world to become the governor of Lusitania in modern Portugal. The timeline here in the sources seems a bit confused. Otho was sent away in 59, but Nero didn't actually marry Poppaea until 3 years later, in 62. Regardless, we will meet back up with Otho next decade on his return to Rome. Okay, we are at 59 AD now, but if you look at the runtime, you'll see we aren't close to being done yet. I wanted to follow Agrippina's story logically before looking at other aspects of Nero's reign and cover a developing geopolitical situation. While Claudius had progressively centralized the administration of the state around himself, Nero, like Caligula before him, made a show of returning power to the Senate. Still only a teenager, Nero's involvement in governing, and his own interest in governing, was minimal. Seneca and Burrus essentially ran the state. They cut taxes and banned the trials that had repeatedly been used to purge enemies. This arrangement seems to have gone exceptionally well. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, from 54 to 59 AD, are called the Quinquennium Neronis, meaning Nero's 5 years, and are considered to be a mini golden age of prosperity for the Roman Empire. The later Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, is said to have looked back on these 5 years as ones of exceptionally good government and prosperity. During these years, Nero spent his days sleeping or groggily signing documents handed to him by his advisors, and he spent his evenings feasting, performing music or theater, or chasing women. His mind did not rest often on the affairs of state, instead focused on becoming a skilled performer. Hidden talent counts for nothing, he once said. The 5 years of bliss began to come to an end, though, in 59 AD, the same year he had his mother executed. Nero got it into his head to eliminate a much wider swath of taxes. The people would love it, he must have thought. But his advisors, the Senate, and anyone who cared about the Roman government functioning properly urged him to reconsider. Facing all of this resistance, he eventually withdrew the proposal. But Rome was put on notice that Nero was becoming more interested in making his own mark in the administration. And Nero was becoming aware that there were many who would not give him exactly what he wanted. Those who opposed Nero's wishes weren't confined to the city of Rome or the Roman Empire itself. In the east, beyond the borders of Cappadocia and Syria, word had reached the Parthian Empire, the successor state to the Seleucids and the Persians of antiquity, that a young, untested emperor was in charge. They took advantage of the situation by gaining a foothold in Armenia. Armenia had the unfortunate position of serving as a buffer state between Rome and Parthia, stuck between the orbits of each. In the prologue episodes of this show, we saw Rome make its first forays into Armenia during the Mithridatic Wars of the 1st century BC. Led by generals Lucullus and Pompey, the Romans had marched to the capital of Tigranocerta, won great victories, and subdued the kingdom. In 20 BC, under Augustus, Armenia had been made a protectorate of Rome. and when vacancies arose, Roman-sponsored kings were placed on the throne. For a century, there had been relative peace along the border between Rome and Parthia, but events began to change around 37 AD, which would snowball into centuries of warfare. In 37, the Parthian-backed Orodes, son of Parthian king Artabanus, took the throne. In Tiberius' last weeks alive, he appointed a rival king named Mithridates of Iberia to be the Roman-backed king of Armenia. If the geography wasn't confusing enough already, this Iberia refers not to the peninsula home to Portugal and Spain, but to a region of the Caucasus Mountains, now home to Georgia. Yes, the country, not the state. While Mithridates of Iberia had Roman support, it wasn't until 42, when Claudius lent him military aid, that Mithridates gained the throne of Armenia. 9 years later, in 51 AD, Mithridates was overthrown by his nephew, Radamistus. This new king ruled harshly, and he quickly became unpopular. Vologases, the new Parthian king, took notice of the Armenian discontent and invaded the country, capturing the two capitals of Artaxata and Tigranocerta. Radamistus fled, but the following winter was harsh, and with the outbreak of a plague, Vologases withdrew his armies. Radamistus quickly took back control of the country, and back on the throne, he was even harsher toward his people. In 53, Vologases returned and Radamistus fled. By the next year, Vologases had placed his younger brother, Tiridates, on the throne of Armenia. Back in Rome, Nero had succeeded Claudius, and this Parthian incursion was seen as a major test for the young emperor. Nero, or more probably his advisors, selected a general named Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo to lead the Roman response. Corbulo had proved himself an able commander during his term in Germania Inferior. Working from his base in Colonia, modern Cologne, Germany, Corbulo had his work cut out for him, keeping order among the still hostile Cherusci and Chauci tribes across the Rhine. He was distinguished for his discipline and training of his soldiers, and also the engineering projects and mixed use of army and navy to secure the frontier. At the time of his commission by Nero, Corbulo was serving as the governor of Asia, the province in western Anatolia, not the whole continent in the modern sense. He packed up and moved to Cappadocia in eastern Anatolia, where he set up camp. He was given supreme command of the east of the empire, an extraordinary amount of power to deal with a special threat. The Romans took Armenia and the Parthians seriously. Diplomacy was tried first, but without success. The situation could have been resolved if Tiridates had agreed to travel to Rome and symbolically receive his kingship from Nero. But Tiridates refused and instead attacked those in Armenia he saw as loyal to Rome. This was fine with Vologases. He was ambitious and committed to the extension of Parthian power. Corbulo began to recruit his army from Galatia, Cappadocia, and especially Syria. Fitting his reputation, Corbulo took the condition and makeup of his army seriously. Any who were deemed too old or in poor health were sent home. Instead of collecting his troops, equipping them, and heading straight for Armenia, Corbulo took his time drilling them into fighting shape. The Romans had been humiliated, but were in no immediate danger. He could take his time. His army spent a frigid winter stationed on the Anatolian plateau to help them prepare for a campaign in the cold and mountainous country of Armenia. His leadership was based on discipline, but despite this, he was respected by his men. Because instead of deserting them to suffer the elements alone, he lived and trained with them, sharing their hardship. Finally, in the spring of 58, Corbulo gathered his 3 legions and his auxiliaries and invaded Armenia. The timing was perfect on the part of the Romans. Vologases and the Persians were distracted by a revolt of the Hyrcanians along the Caspian Sea coast and incursions from steppe nomads in the east. Tiridates made overtures for peace and tried to call a meeting between him and Corbulo, but neither side trusted the other, and Tiridates fled when he saw Corbulo approach, backed by a fully armored and battle-ready legion. Now sure of war, Tiridates attempted to disrupt the Roman supply lines. Corbulo had carefully protected them with forts, and the attacks were unsuccessful. Corbulo now headed deep into the center of Armenia, easily capturing at least 3 forts and slaying the garrisons. Several nearby towns surrendered to the Romans. With these forts under control, the Romans now marched on Artaxata, one of the 2 Armenian capitals, this one in the north. Tiridates had so far avoided Corbulo, but he couldn't let them capture Artaxata without a fight. As the Romans arrived outside the city, Tiridates and his army approached and gave battle. Corbulo arranged his army into a hollow square, with soldiers facing out on all sides. They were under strict orders not to break formation. They had to endure the peppering arrows and charges of the Parthian horse archers for hours, waiting for an opportunity. Their discipline held, and as night approached, Tiridates saw he could not break the Romans. He fled with his army. Victorious, Corbulo allowed the residents of the city of Artaxata to leave peacefully, but when they had done so, the Romans set the city afire. With the new year of 59, the Roman army headed south, now into the dry lands of the far north of Mesopotamia. Here they suffered from lack of water and food. The army now circled back west and headed for the second capital of Armenia, Tigranocerta. As the main army approached the capital, a rearguard of auxiliaries, under a commander named Severus, blocked a Parthian army led by Vologases from entering Armenia. With the Romans outside their walls and no hope of a relief army, the citizens of Tigranocerta surrendered. The Romans now controlled Armenia. Tigranes VI was proclaimed by the Romans as the new king of Armenia in place of Tiridates. Corbulo installed Tigranocerta with a garrison to protect the new king, and he headed back to Roman territory. Corbulo's reward was to become the governor of Syria. This was a rich province that would make Corbulo wealthy, but also kept him close to Armenia in case the Parthians attempted to creep back in. And creep back in they would. Corbulo's extraordinary and rapid success was largely thanks to the Parthians dealing with more urgent threats close to home. Now those revolts and invasions were largely dealt with, and Vologases was free to turn his attention back to exerting his influence over Armenia. Corbulo's rest would be short. The war had only just begun. In April of 59, an omen appeared in the skies above North Africa. The sun, high in the sky, lost its light, and night covered the earth for several minutes. The Mediterranean world would have done well to heed the warning of this solar eclipse. As we will see, the 60s will be a decade of chaos across the Roman world. Subjected people will rise up, emperors will fall, and great cities will burn. Instead of the 60s, though, the next episode of 202 Decades you will see in your feed will be a bonus episode, a tour of the provinces of the empire during the 1st century. A lot of the empire has been neglected in the story so far, so I wanted to cover the missing areas. At the time of this writing, it is almost complete, so I intend to publish that episode about a week from this publication date. From there, I will do my best to publish the 60s as soon as possible, but with so much content to cover, expect it to be a little longer than 2 weeks. But it should be a long episode too. This is one of those big decades. Thanks again for being patient while waiting for this episode. While I've been away, I have produced some more 202 Decades related content. First is a YouTube channel where I intend to make shortened versions of the prologues and decades as videos. Check it out, like and subscribe. And if you're enjoying this series, please leave a rating and a review. I'll see you next time.